Hello, welcome to JAIC's Mission Possible, the opening session from the Innovators Retreat, IR 25. Let's jump right in. The Jewish people have survived with our sacred texts that have been passed down through generations. They help define us. They sustained our identities over centuries and in different locations in the world, to the point where Jews have existed for so long and in so many places that most cultures have references to us going back 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 years. Our ancient wisdom etched within our people the ability to have four real big functions. We can live with uncertainty, meaning that we don't necessarily have to have all the answers right away. When we think about our past, we don't think about it as a burden or as a victim. We think about it as resilience and strength and how we survive in a world that is inhospitable to us. We understand that the idea of resilience and endurance and hope are forms of development that we do with our children in each generation. And we embody the courage to believe because we don't tolerate intolerance. That would be cowardice. But instead, we embody the courage to believe strongly in what we do and why we do it. About 100 or so years ago, we started developing the concept of Jewish day schools. And Jewish day schools were able to take this design and essentially increase its intensity and emphasize certain points like making a network of people in your local area. But Jewish day schools, while a great idea, bumped into a significant problem in the midst of their development. In order to explain that, let me give you an analogy. The painting in front of you, Sunday Afternoon on the Island of La Grande Jatte, was painted by George Seurat in the early 1880s. He was the first to design a concept known as pointillism. Now, he wasn't actually an artist in the sense of that's how he made his money. He was really a scientist, and he developed ideas of how to view things and understand it. And he understood that if you put a lot of dots next to each other, instead of it being like long strokes like the rest of the Impressionists, he would have these dots and dashes, and that would make up the entirety of the scene. So if you're standing in the Art Institute in Chicago, and you are looking at this painting from about 20 feet away in the room, this is what you'd see. It is a beautiful portrait. It really looks like it all comes together, warm colors. And even if you kind of look at it a little bit from a little bit of an angle, you can see that there's almost movement in what's happening. If you get to about 5 feet away, you focus on the individuals here, you'll see that at the young girl's feet, there are little teeny dots and dashes that you can start to make out. And you can start to see as you get closer and closer that the shadows that look like they were whole before, you can now see are made of multiple colors, which makes it a little bit even more strange. Now, when you get within 2 feet, you start to see that actually are white spaces that are on there, that actually there are dots that weren't filled in the original canvas, and that they help to create part of the mood of what's going on. And again, if you're this close, usually the guard is telling you, please step back, sir, that's close enough. But we get a chance to see the little teeny bits of how these pictures are designed. The Jewish day schools in North America and this design, as we get much, much closer, they really fell victim to something called Taylorism. Frederick Taylor wrote in the early 1900s a book about systems in which he was describing how a manager would take over a place and how they would get the greatest efficiency and how they would get the greatest output. And in order to do that, he basically laid out four big ideas over the span of his book, which got really absorbed as the most important functions in dealing with large systems, which, as I'll talk about in a moment, also includes the public school systems and by connection, Jewish day schools in North America. One of the major ideas in Taylorism is that whatever we can prove is the greatest methodology, that's better than any inherited wisdom. Any folksy inherited wisdom is not nearly as important as whatever methodology we're thinking about. that we can prove. Scientific methodology is really for selection and training. That is that we are going to be able to tell you right now, this second, which person is going to be better, which is not. But what it does is it makes a methodology in which we're saying not everyone gets the right kind of selection, the right kind of training. Third is that there's harmony and cooperation as management designs and enforces it, meaning that everyone gets along because management says so. The people's voice in this varies depending on what kind of system you have set up, but mostly it's about the management controlling and designing it because they're the ones who need to demonstrate the efficiency and maximum output of the system. And speaking of that, maximizing output to increase productivity, eliminate the unnecessary, and optimize the process as assessed by the manager. So if the manager says, look, in order to get more work done, we're going to need to reduce breaks in order to do that. That is really the assessment of the manager, and there is no voice from the people in order to be able to push back on that, or other people from the outside saying, I don't know if that's the case. When this got translated into Jewish day schools, you can see how this would be really harmful. When you have inherited wisdom from 3,300 years ago that helped define us as a people, that really needs to be incorporated. Not just what I can demonstrate right now. So if I can demonstrate that I can memorize words on a quiz, that doesn't mean necessarily that I know how to pass down the wisdom of our people. The selection and training is very difficult because there are people who rise above the rest, but the kind of selection and training really needs to happen over time. It can't be an immediate tracking of individuals at a certain place where you say, well, these guys don't have skills in kindergarten or first grade, and therefore we're going to essentially put them in the lower, slower group until they graduate high school. Harmony and cooperation is a two-way street, and oftentimes it is not seen that way in many schools, and how they manage it is seen as, here are the rules, you need to listen to them or suffer punishments. And when you're maximizing output and eliminating the unnecessary, you're really relying on a single individual's understanding of what it is to increase productivity instead of what it is to increase the development of the individuals. The individuals in the class are not a product. They are individuals who are growing, and therefore they have a certain type of growing, sometimes building them up, sometimes allowing them to grow on their own. These are different things that you need to really work with. You can't just say, well, what's the maximum output? So I can demonstrate by giving them tests that they do well on, or a test that I demonstrate that I'm a good teacher by failing them, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to think about how this affected the Jewish day schools, what Taylorism has really done over the last, certainly 75 years worth of Jewish day school history. So for this session, I want you to consider the following. We're going to talk about how to be able to redefine what schools are about. Considering the values, clarity, timelessness, and compelling perspective of the mission statement. Mission statements themselves usually get created by a small group, and the larger group needs to listen to it because the small group is the one who's provided the guidance, the money, the building, whatever it is. So generally, they are the ones who provide what the mission statement is, what's happening. That really doesn't incorporate how mission statements should come about. That's a different conversation. Think about the alignment between the mission statement and the written policies of the school. If you have a mission statement that says, we're going to help children grow, and you would have policies necessarily that lean into that, that's difficult. Examine what might happen if the mission statement and policies are misaligned. That's basically one of the major functions that happens, is that you have a mission statement that says we want children to become lifelong learners, and then we do lots of policies that stop them from doing that. So we want to make sure to have all of that flowing in a way that makes it so that it's less focused on what the mission statement's high-mindedness is, and more about the mission statement and the policies really being aligned in a way that makes them work. So we gave them 3 designs of case studies to work on, about tefillah, about a certain disruptive student, and about a surplus and budgeting for the future, and what the choices would be that we would do with that design. Those case studies are very important and not part of this design. So at first, you want to think about this. Think about the following. What gives the mission statement authority? Why is it that I should care what this thing says? Why should the mission statement and the policies align an institution? Why is that the case? What results when the mission statement and policies do not align? Those three ideas, if you do a think, pair, share on your own thinking and then pair up with a friend and share it with the group, you're going to start to get some interesting ideas about what happens when you put all that together. When you think about how that works, think about this. Mission statement establishes what the value, the clarity of the vision, compelling perspective of the institution, the timelessness that's going on. The policies are creating guidelines out of the values and perspective of the mission statements. And in the practice framework, you're implementing those policies in order to cause the organization to fulfill the vision of the mission statement. So it's three parts that are going here. As a somewhat of an example, if you give a mission statement, we give students the skills, knowledge, and expertise to lead exceptional lives rooted in strong Jewish identity, then the policy that's in the middle isn't really a policy. Policy should probably read, the school will provide a supportive and engaging environment that encourages the growth of meaningful Jewish identity for all students, which includes social engagement, emotional well-being, and academic enrichment. And finally, the practice framework, how you apply those policies, which could change from place to place, but starts off from the policies and then moves into a particular practice framework. So this is a perfectly understandable setup as we have this. If you have the same sort of mission statement, but you have every student will stay within academic guidelines, maybe rules and dress code, but instead put it as a policy statement, which would read, is the expectation of this school that all students adhere to the school's academic guidelines, behavioral rules, and dress code. These guidelines are in place to foster a positive and productive learning environment for all members of the school community. That is what a real policy sounds like. Then again, the practice framework, which would come out of these policies, is misaligned with the mission statement. So that's really something that would not work with what the mission statement is going, and therefore you would have instantaneous problems in the school. Now, when you think through the two case studies, the case studies that I mentioned before about the tefillah, the disruptive of the student, the budgeting issues that you might think about, you come to the same basic conclusions, which is if you start with the mission, you get 6 big benefits for an organization where the mission, policies, and practices are all aligned. Focus and efficiency is part of a clear mission and aligned policies, help focus efforts and resources, avoiding wasted time and energy on activities that don't contribute to the core goal. Often you will hear really good managers in these kind of schools, as in principals and heads of school, that talk about mission drift. And does this really focus on what the mission of the school is and those type of things? It might be fun for the students, and that might be part of it, but just focus on the mission. Better decision-making, meaning at times when there are questions as to how we apply things and how we apply new things, that we have, if the policies and mission are aligned, it's easier to make decisions that are consistent with the overall direction, and that you're not going to get some people making decisions here, some people making decisions in a different way. Especially as you get larger institutions, you don't want the right hand and the left hand not knowing what's going on. The third is employee engagement. It is extraordinary the number of times that you will have people who are buying into the mission, and then someone goes off in a rogue direction and they are not corrected. And everyone else says, well, why am I doing this? Why am I being involved in the mission and trying to do the policies, which I really bought into, and this other person seems to do whatever it is? It would, in fact, increase motivation and increases morale when everyone is rowing in the same direction. That is really just a basic of how this kind of study works. When you think about resource allocation, like we were saying before about the extra budget pieces, are we going to, if we're saying that we want lifelong learners, are we spending time with kids who have learning issues and saying we're going to really allocate that they're going to have help, that we're going to design classes so that they're going to feel included, those type of things. Adaptability, a strong mission provides a framework for adapting to changes and challenges. That means that when you have problems like the entire world being shut down because of a pandemic, how does that work? What we've seen is a lot of the schools that came out of the pandemic really in good stead were schools that had aligned mission statements, policies, and practices. And that worked out as best as it could considering the situation. And the final is really important, and that when the adults role model for the students the values of the institution, you start having really singular and consistent messages that the students experience. And what I mean by that is, if we say that your part of your mission statement is to create a kind and caring person, and the teachers reflect that kind and caring person, then you're not getting the message of, well, this kid did something wrong, and so it's okay to be nasty and angry when they do something wrong. Rather, you have kindness being the call from the mission statement and the policy and the way that it does. And when the teachers role model that, it makes a common message for the students and common experience for them to be able to say what they experienced. Considering these hot topics for a Jewish day school that you're going to need to worry about regarding from the mission statement to the practice, dress code and behavior during tefillah, by the way, are things that are very personal to the students and something that they work on. What kind of food is allowed in schools, if it's allowed at all, who gets invited to events, homework assessment, certainly the classroom management and discipline, educational philosophy, hiring policy, social media use, educational technology in Israel. You can't think of a stronger argument for a school's institutional design than to figure out how you're going to respond to what's going on in Israel. And when you have schools that did missions to Israel during 2024, when they started really getting into the idea of going and visiting, and sent a message. And I can tell you from the students who graduated since then, or even the ones who are further along since then, they understood the message. The message is that Israel isn't just a nice idea that we mention, and that we once a year on Yom HaAtzmaut that we have falafel or something. What we do is we really care deeply in our soul that Israel is a country that is taken care of. If you have that as your mission, then that is something that you need to actually do in your policies and your practices. So how does this bridge to your school? We have a lot of interesting theory here. Let me tell you a little bit about that in a parable. My mother, Aleha Shalom, was a professor of city planning. She used to deal a lot with how do you get the city to do things within the policies that they've designed. So in this parable, she used to tell her students the following. The grasshopper spent the summer flitting around and being very jolly and not really collecting anything for the fall. And he realized as it started to get colder that if he didn't do something soon, he was going to die. He was going to starve. So he came to the wise old owl and said, "Wise old owl, I ask you, I've been flitting away the summer, running around doing things. What should I do in order to survive the winter?" And the wise old owl says to the grasshopper, "You should turn into an ant and start storing food and you'll survive the winter." And the grasshopper hoppity hops away and then realizes that he has another question, turns around, hoppity hops back to the wise old owl and says, "Wise old owl, how do I turn into an ant?" And the owl responded, I deal with policy, I don't deal with implementation. The reason that works in this is that you have to figure out how to do implementation in your school. We've given you policy understandings about going from mission, policy, and application, but think about these guiding questions that we have in front of you. I'm not going to read all of them, but think about this. What each policy says about the mission statement is something that will be scrutinized by people who are in their low points in emotional energy. When you see misalignment and people feel the misalignment, that would be moments in which you're not going to get high morale and high commitment and high motivation. If everything is in alignment, you feel everything is doing great, how do you improve to actualize the mission statement better? And that's one of those things that people often talk about when they say, well, we're doing great. And the answer is, yeah, but let's do a little forward looking and thinking about how we're going to apply this as we're moving forward and what might be some threats or other sorts of outward issues that might be a problem. So looking forward, what can we do? So let's conclude and think about what we're doing here. We talked about mission, we talked about policies, we talked about implementation. And we talked about how when those things aren't aligned, your school is going to really suffer in a lot of ways. So think of the mission statement as a living document. Don't set it in stone and then put it in a back room and never deal with it. It's got to be looked at and updated once every few years by the stakeholders into the school. The stakeholders don't just mean the people who are on the board. It means that there's got to be some way to include the educators and the parent body in understanding about this mission so that it is, in fact, a singular mission that defines what you're doing. Since everyone is involved in implementing a Jewish vision, these are the things that reverse the effects of Taylorism. We talked about before about the awful things that happens in which we have managers who are trying to do maximum output. If you control what is happening by mission statement and policies, you can reverse this natural leaning towards Taylorism to think about what's demonstrable. What does it mean when we say that students are doing well in school? How does happiness really play into this? How does joy in learning play into this? These are questions about how to do things that make it so that your school is reversing these ideas that are natural in schools so that in a Jewish school, they don't rear their ugly heads. And to create that reality, you really need a toolkit. And that's session 2. I wish you guys well. Review the things here and be in touch with JEIC if you need to review the material.